In the autumn of 1884, in the limestone hill country of central Texas, where the cedar broke the wind and the pale rock showed through the skin of every slope, like the skeleton of something older than memory, a woman named Nora Voss paid $9 for a property no one else would touch. She was 27 years old. She had $41 remaining to her name, a leather survey satchel she had carried through 4 years of field work, and a particular kind of quiet that does not come from having nothing to say, but from having learned. The homestead she purchased sat 3 miles east of the town of Harlan, on a wide shelf of hill above a dry creek bed, ringed on 2 sides by cedar thicket, and exposed on the third to a view of the valley that would have been worth something once. The property had been empty for 11 years. The man who sold it to her at the county seat could not hold her gaze for the full length of the transaction, and the county clerk who recorded the deed used the word haunted twice before she finished signing her name. She did not ask him to explain. She had read the case history in the county tax roll, and she knew the story, or enough of it. What she did not yet know was what the house itself had kept, sealed and patient, through 11 years of rain and silence. If you have ever watched a person purchase something the whole town warned them against and wondered what they were calculating while the crowd was shaking its head, stay close to this one. She knew exactly what she was looking for. The homestead had belonged to a family named Pruitt. Caleb Pruitt had built the main structure in 1866, 1 year after the war closed and 2 years before the county land office recorded the parcel formally in his name, working at the pace of a man who does not rush mortar because he understands that mortar does not forgive impatience. He was a stonemason by trade and by inheritance, a man who had learned to read the grain and cleavage of stone from his own father in the limestone country of Kentucky before he carried the knowledge west like a second skeleton, invisible and load-bearing beneath everything else he did. He and his wife Martha raised 4 children at the Harlan homestead. They paid their county taxes in full every year for 17 years, kept a kitchen garden on the south side of the house, and raised a small number of cattle on the back acreage. By every measure available to the era, they were exactly what the land grant program had promised: settled, productive, and entitled to remain. Then, in the winter of 1872 and into the spring of 1873, a company out of San Antonio called the Bower Land and Settlement Trust began acquiring acreage throughout the hill country counties. The mechanism it employed was not violence. It was precision of the administrative kind, the sort of cruelty that arrives on good paper with clean handwriting and notarized seals, dressed in the language of correction and legal obligation, indistinguishable at first glance from the ordinary business of a functioning land office. Caleb Pruitt received an assessment notice in January of 1873. The notice stated that his homestead deed, as recorded in 1868, was irregular. The original survey of 1866, it claimed, had incorporated a measuring error of a specific kind, placing the northeastern boundary of his parcel, 11 acres, onto land belonging to an earlier grant that had since been absorbed by Bower's trust holdings. He was given 30 days to vacate the 11 disputed acres, or to settle a corrective fee of $240, representing the assessed value of the disputed ground. It was a sum he did not have and could not raise inside 30 days, and every person in Harlan County who knew Caleb Pruitt knew it. He protested the notice through every channel available to him. He wrote to the county land office. He wrote to the state land commissioner. He sought a second surveyor at his own expense. The second surveyor, a man named Tate, came out to the property and walked the boundaries and told Caleb privately that he could find no error in the original measurements, but that his opinion alone, without a formal filed survey, would not hold legal weight against a company with notarized documents. Tate wrote a letter to that effect, which he gave to Caleb, and which Caleb kept. The Pruitts left in March of 1873. Martha packed what could be carried. Caleb locked the front door with the key he had made for it, a key he did not surrender to anyone, and they walked off the property they had built and kept for 17 years and did not look back. Because looking back at something you cannot change is a particular cruelty you learn to refuse. No one purchased the property after that. The county carried the outstanding taxes in a suspended account for several years, then began accumulating the record. The house sat empty. The swallows colonized the north eaves. Vines worked the limestone on the shaded side. Stories accumulated around the property the way stories always do around abandoned places, gathering detail with each telling, until what had been a story about an injustice became a story about a haunting, which is a different kind of story and much easier to leave alone. By the time she stepped off the stage in Harlan in the second week of October 1884, the Homestead had 11 years of back taxes on its record, a reputation for sounds in the walls, and a purchase price of $9. She had read the tax notice 3 times before she believed the figure. The sounds in the walls were swallows. This was her private assessment the moment she read the notice, and it proved correct. She had come from San Marcos, where she had worked for 4 years as an assistant surveyor and field operator under her father, Amos Voss, a precise and patient man who had spent his working life reading the legal descriptions of land against the physical ground that the descriptions pretended to describe. He had taught her the transit and the chain and the plumb bob and the level before she was 15, and had taught her also the field book notation method he had developed over 20 years of practice, a system of cross-referenced measurements and azimuth records that could, in principle, be verified by any qualified surveyor working from the same benchmark stones. He had told her once that a survey is a promise the land makes to whoever owns a piece of paper about it, and that the promise is only as good as the person who measured it. Amos died of a lung complaint in the early spring of 1884, leaving her his instruments, his satchel, his field notebooks, going back to 1861, and a set of debts modest enough to settle with the bank savings inside 3 months. The firm he had worked for declined to retain her as a full surveyor after his death, citing a policy that the partner explained with visible discomfort. She spent the following 3 months doing what survey consulting work she could find independently in San Marcos and the surrounding territory, billing at slightly below her father's rates and doing the work to his standard. It kept her busy and kept her short of comfortable. In August of 1884, she had occasion to pull her father's field notebooks for a boundary consultation on an unrelated parcel in Caldwell County, and in doing so she opened the 1871 volume, which she had not read carefully since she was a girl. On the 43rd page, she found the entry for the Pruitt Homestead Survey, conducted in the summer of 1871 on behalf of the County Land Office as part of a routine verification program. Her father's notation was specific, as it always was. He had set secondary datum pins inside the structure of the building, using the interior southeast corner wall as a reference point, and had noted the azimuth and chain distance to the county benchmark stone. He had filed the field book with the county recorder in San Marcos. In the margin of the entry, in the smaller secondary hand he used for observations that did not belong strictly to the measurement record, he had written, "In the margin, Caleb Pruitt, stonemason, good work, careful man." She read that line, and then she read the tax roll notice again, and then she wrote down the purchase price and did the arithmetic on her remaining savings, and then she made her arrangements. The auctioneer, a compact, deliberate man named Webb, who wore his county authority lightly and seemed to mean most of what he said, counted her $9 twice and offered her a ride out to the property in his wagon, which she accepted. On the drive through the cedar, he gave her the history of the homestead in the way that a person gives a history they have always considered unfinished, with pauses where conclusions should be, and a kind of low-grade dissatisfaction with the way it had ended. He told her about the Pruitts, about the Bauer Company's assessment, about Caleb Pruitt's attempts to contest it. He told her the roof had likely failed. He told her the sounds in the walls were what most people said they were, though he himself suspected wind over the chimney opening, which in his experience could produce a sound that made a person imagine company they did not have. He did not use the word reckless. That came later, from others, who had not driven her out there and had not seen her face when the house came into view through the cedar. The house announced itself with its roof. This was the first surprise, and she felt it as a kind of settling in her chest, a piece of the calculation confirmed. The front wall was limestone block, coursed and fitted with a plainness that most buildings in the hill country did not bother to achieve, the mortar tight in every joint, the corners square to within what looked at a glance like a fraction of a degree. 18 years since the structure went up, and the walls had not moved. That was the testimony of a man who understood what stone does and what it requires. The door was locked. The key was not present. She stood on the low stone step and examined the lock mechanism through the keyhole, and then she stepped back and examined the case itself, the iron housing, the keyhole plate. It was a mortise lock, of a kind she had not encountered outside of her father's equipment catalogs, the ones he had kept on the shelf above his work table, and which she had read cover to cover as a child with the same appetite she had read everything else. The plate had been set at a height slightly below the standard, a centimeter or less, a difference so small that a person not looking for it would not see it. She set her finger against the plate and pressed lightly and felt the countersink, which was not a flaw but a decision. Someone had placed the plate where he intended it. She reached into the satchel for the pick set her father had kept there. He had carried it for the same reason. He had carried the hand level, because there were in land work doors that must be entered before they can be properly measured. The lock opened in 4 minutes. She had estimated 6. The air inside the house had not moved in 11 years. It did not smell of decay. It smelled of cut limestone and dry cedar, and beneath those, the faint mineral warmth of linseed oil. The floorboards carried a coat of it still visible beneath the dust, a honey-dark sheen that told her the man who had laid them had understood they needed sealing. The floor had been oiled, and oiled correctly, and the oil had held. She did not step inside for a full minute. She stood in the doorway and let the house come to her. The swallows were in the north eaves, audible but quiet at this hour of the afternoon. The rustling and intermittent chirp of birds who had found a suitable cavity and saw no reason to be dramatic about it. The plaster in one corner near the sleeping loft had cracked and shed a section roughly the size of a book. The damage old and dry and stopped, the work of a single bad join in the stone course below it rather than systemic failure. The ceiling was sound, the floor was sound. The fireplace was limestone, fitted with a raised hearth that matched the coarse work of the exterior walls. Along the south wall ran a work table at a height slightly higher than standard, built from planked cedar and secured to the wall with iron brackets of the same hand-forged quality as the door hardware. At the back, a door stood open on its hinges into a second smaller room, a storeroom or perhaps once a dedicated workspace. And above the work table, set into the plaster of the south wall at regular intervals, were 4 small iron pins, each no larger than a finishing nail, each seated in a tiny ring of hardened mortar. She crossed the room and stood before them. Her father had described pins exactly like these in his field notation from 1871. He had set them as interior data marks, reference points from which his azimuth bearings and elevation readings could be cross-checked against the exterior survey. They were the anchors of a verification method, a way of building the measurement record twice, once in the field and once inside the structure, so that if one record were ever challenged, the other could confirm it. The pins had not been touched. She set her fingers on the leftmost one and pressed, and it held with the solidity of something that had been placed with intention and left in peace. She got out her father's field notebook and opened to the 1871 entry, and she compared the described spacing and orientation of the pins against what she saw in the wall before her, and they matched in every detail. This was the second confirmation. The first had been the roof. The second was this. There was more to find, and she had not yet walked the exterior. The following 2 days she worked the boundary. She rose before dawn each morning, made a small fire in the stone fireplace, and ate quickly. And then she took the transit and the chain and the plumb bob and went out to begin the first run. The method was the same her father had taught her, and which she had practiced on enough parcels in enough Texas counties to have made it her own. The careful step of the chain, the note of every deviation in terrain that might affect the measurement, the repeated confirmation of the azimuth from the benchmark stone, using the interior datum pins as the secondary reference. She ran the full perimeter twice, 2 complete independent measurements, because a single run is a claim, and a double run is evidence. On the second run, she found the discrepancy. It was at the northeastern corner, where the Bauer assessment had placed the disputed overlap with the prior grant. Her measurement put the Pruitt boundary 9 feet inside the undisputed parcel, not across any prior holding. The Bauer claim had asserted an overlap of 11 acres. There was no overlap. There had never been any overlap. The discrepancy between her measurement and the Bauer survey's claim boundary was consistent with a specific kind of instrument error, the kind produced when a transit is set on uneven ground, without proper leveling, which the slope of the terrain at the northeastern corner. She ran that corner a 3rd time by itself, changing the instrument placement and using 2 independent backsights. The result did not change. She wrote it in the field book with the date and the weather conditions and the name of every instrument she had used. And then she closed the book and sat on the cedar slope with the valley spread below her and the October sky pale and enormous overhead. And she thought about a man who had locked his door in March of 1873 and carried the key because he believed or hoped or simply could not bring himself to do otherwise, that someone would one day come back to what he had built and see it for what it was. She went into Harlan on the morning of the 6th day. She had not gone to announce herself or to make any preliminary claim. She had gone to find a man named Hector Garza, whose name appeared in her father's 1871 field notebook as chain man and witness, and who was, according to the latest county directory she had consulted before leaving San Marcos, still living in Harlan, at an address on the north end of the main street. She found the house without difficulty, a small adobe structure with a cedar post porch on which a man sat in a ladder-back chair, with the particular stillness of someone who has learned to be comfortable with extended quiet. He was perhaps 60. Lean, with a limp she noticed when he stood. He looked at the survey satchel on her shoulder before he looked at her face. "You bought the Pruitt place," he said. She confirmed that she had. He said nothing for a moment. Then he stepped back and pulled the door open wider and gestured her inside. They sat at a wooden table in his kitchen for 2 hours. He had a direct manner and a memory that proved reliable when she checked his recollections against her father's written records. He confirmed that he had served as Amos Voss's chainman on the 1871 Pruitt Homestead survey. He confirmed the method her father had used, the interior datum pins, the double-run perimeter, the filed field book, He confirmed that Caleb Pruitt had been present on the day of the survey and had shown her father the front door lock, which Amos had examined with the absorbed attention he gave to any well-made mechanism. She showed him her father's field notation about the interior pins. He read it twice. He set the book down on the table. "That mean what I think it means," he said. She told him it did. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said Bauer, in the way a person says a word they have been holding in their mouth a long time and are finally deciding to set somewhere outside themselves. She asked him if he would be willing to sign an affidavit attesting to his presence at the 1871 survey and to the instrument and chain methods her father had used. He was quiet again, longer this time, and she waited without pressing, because the question was not a small one. It asked him to put his name to something that would be read by people with standing to object, and it asked him to do it for a family he had not seen in 11 years, on behalf of a woman he had known for 2 hours. He said he had been waiting 11 years for someone to ask it, and he would sign whatever she put in front of him. She wrote the affidavit that evening at the kitchen table in the homestead by lantern light, drafting it in the plain declarative language her father had used in every document she had ever watched him compose. Short sentences, specific measurements, named dates and named instruments, no ornamentation. The language of a witness who intends to be understood. The rain came in the 3rd week. It came the way October rains come in the Texas Hill Country, without announcement, and with the settled authority of something that has been building for weeks and has decided to stop waiting. 3 days of low gray sky and steady water. The dry creek bed below the homestead became a running channel 6 inches deep, brown and deliberate and loud enough to hear from the south window of the main room. The cedar held in the wind, and the limestone shed the water in clean sheets, and the house stood without complaint, because Caleb Pruitt had set the foundation stones deep and had built the drainage courses into the base of each exterior wall the way a man builds who has thought seriously about what a building must endure. She spent the first day of rain at the work table with her father's 1871 field book, rereading every page. She had read it in San Marcos in August, and again on the stage coming west, and again on the first evening in the house. And she read it now a 4th time because she had learned, in 4 years of field work alongside her father, that documents do not yield everything on the first read or the second. They yield it when you are ready to ask the right question. On the 3rd reading of the entry for the 30th of June, 1871, she found a notation in the margin she had registered before, but not stopped to examine. 2-line entry in her father's secondary hand, written smaller than the column measurements and slightly tilted as if added while standing rather than sitting. It read, simply, that P had placed a confirmation mark in the SW cornerstone, south face, 3rd course. She read it twice. She took the lantern to the southwest corner of the main room and crouched at the base of the wall. The coursework was Caleb Pruitt's, each block fitted with the characteristic flatness of his work, the mortar joints consistent and even. 3rd, course from the floor, south face. She ran her fingers along the mortar joint of the 3rd course, pressing lightly at intervals, reading the wall, the way her father had taught her to read any material thing. Slowly, without conclusion, attending to what it actually offered rather than what she expected to find, she found it near the center of the course, a section of mortar, perhaps 6 inches long, that had the slightly different density and texture of a fill rather than an original set. Not a patch applied from outside as a repair would be, but a fill applied from within a cavity, the mortar pressed in from behind. It would have been invisible to anyone not running their fingers along it in good light. She took the small pick from the satchel, a thin-bladed tool she had used on hundreds of pin sets and survey stakes, and she worked the mortar carefully and without hurry. It loosened in sections, dry and chalky, and behind the 6th inch, she felt the give of open space. Behind the mortar, seated in a recess no larger than a boot box, cut into the interior face of the limestone block, was a tin case of the kind that had been sold in hardware and supply stores in the 1860 seconds for the storage of important papers against damp and fire. The lid was sealed with a folded strip of lead pressed firmly around the lip, the kind of closure a thoughtful man makes when he wants to be certain that the years do not get into what he is protecting. She set it on the work table and looked at it for a moment. The rain moved across the cedar ridges outside. The creek ran in the dark below the hill. The swallows were quiet in the eaves, settled against the weather. The lantern flame was steady, the oil good, the room warm enough. She opened the case with her father's penknife, working the lead strip free with care. Inside, wrapped first in oilskin and then in a second layer of brown paper, were 3 documents. She unfolded each one in sequence and read it in full before moving to the next. The first was a handwritten transcription of the original land grant for the Pruitt homestead, dated 1866, bearing the county recorder's mark and seal, transcribed in a clear, deliberate hand she recognized from the construction of the house itself, the same hand that had built the mortar joints and fitted the lock plate, a hand accustomed to working within tolerances. The second was a letter from the surveyor Tate, dated August of 1872, addressed to Caleb Pruitt. In it, Tate stated plainly that he had been approached the previous spring by a representative of a land company from San Antonio requesting a revised survey of several parcels in the hill country, including the Pruitt homestead, and that he had declined the engagement. Not a neutral measurement, but a specific result, finding an overlap, where Tate's own prior professional opinion found none, had been determined before the survey was to be conducted. He named the company. It was Bauer. He named the representative. He named the date of the approach. He said he was putting this in writing because he believed, based on his understanding of how such companies operated, that Caleb Pruitt would need it eventually. The third document was a hand-drawn plat of the Pruitt homestead, executed in the same careful hand as the first document, with every stone corner of the property marked, each side measured, and the distance noted twice, the second measurement checked in a different ink, as if done on a separate day. In the lower margin, in a stonemason's plain, careful print, Caleb Pruitt had written that the measures were set in the southeast corner wall above the bench, and that any man with a level could confirm them, and that they would not lie. She sat with the 3 documents for a long time. She was not trembling. She was not moved to anything loud or expressive. She was still, in the deep way a person becomes still when something they have been working toward arrives at last and settles into place. She had known from the first reading of her father's 1871 field book that the measurements were sound. She had known from her own 2-run survey that the Bauer boundary claim was full. She had known, from the affidavit she had drafted with Hector Garza, that there was a credible witness to the instrument work that underpinned everything. What she had not known, until this moment, was that Caleb Pruitt himself had anticipated the challenge, had gathered what evidence he could, and had built it into the house with the same care and intention he had built everything else. He had trusted the house. He had trusted that it would outlast what had been done to him. He had trusted that the right person would find what he had placed there. She put the 3 documents back in the tin case and placed the case in her survey satchel. Then she went to bed and slept through the rest of the rain. The filing process occupied most of November. She had not retained a lawyer. She had spent enough time alongside her father in land dispute consultations to understand the mechanism well enough to proceed without one. And the case, she believed, was not legally complex, once the documentary record was complete. What it required was precision and patience, both of which she had in adequate supply. She filed with the county land office in San Marcos in the second week of November, attaching 5 elements. The first was Hector Garza's signed and notarized affidavit. The second was her own survey field notes from both runs of the perimeter boundary check, with the northeastern corner measurements documented in full. The third was a certified copy of Amos Voss's 1871 field book, as previously filed with the county recorder, obtained through a formal records request she had submitted in October, while the survey work was still in progress. The fourth was the 3 documents from the tin case, for which she had arranged photographic copies through a traveling glass plate photographer in Harlan before submitting the originals to the filing. The fifth was a brief written description of the interior datum pins and their confirmed correspondence with her father's field notation, which she included not because it was legally necessary, but because it supplied the foundation on which everything else rested. Her filing asked for 3 specific remedies: a corrected deed reflecting the proper boundary of the parcel as established by the 1866 original grant and confirmed by the 1871 Voss survey; the cancellation of the Bower Land and Settlement Trust's assessment notice of 1873 as issued on the basis of a boundary claim not supported by any accurate measurement of record; and formal notification to the Pruitt family or their living descendants that the record had been corrected and the assessment voided. She was careful to state that she sought no damages and no transfer of title. The property was hers by purchase. She was not seeking restoration for the Pruitts in the sense of returning what they had lost, because the law in its present form did not offer that, and she was not a person given to requesting what was not available. She was seeking the correction of a false record and the acknowledgement that a false record had stood for 11 years where an accurate one had been suppressed. The Bower Land and Settlement Trust had contracted considerably since 1873. Its principal investor had died in 1879. Several of its hill country holdings had been sold or transferred in the intervening years, and the trust itself had been reorganized twice, under different names, before reverting to its original designation. The man who had managed the hill country acquisitions in 1872 and 1873, a notary named Desmond, who had worked out of the San Antonio office, still maintained a professional address there, and it was Desmond who received the county land office's formal inquiry. His response, which arrived at the county land office in January of 1885, did not contest the boundary measurements. It offered, instead, a series of procedural objections. The Tate letter, Desmond claimed, was a private communication and not a filed document. The interior datum pins were not mentioned in the original filed survey and could not be treated as evidence of that survey's scope. The tin case materials, having been sealed in a wall for 11 years, could not be authenticated with certainty. The county land officer, a deliberate man named Aiken, who had worked the office for 14 years, and who had seen this kind of response in other forms and from other companies, addressed each objection in 2 pages of written findings, methodically and without heat. The Tate letter named the company and the representative and the date, and described the requested survey outcome in specific terms. Tate had died in 1879, but the letter was in his identified hand and had been preserved in conditions that supported its authenticity. The interior datum pins were referenced explicitly in the filed 1871 field book, which had been in the county recorder's custody continuously since that year. The tin case materials, including the Pruitt plat, were consistent in hand and paper and content with documents of their stated date, and the plat measurements corresponded with undocumented survey tolerances to the other measurements of record. Aiken issued his findings the 7th of February, 1885. The corrected deed was recorded on the 14th, She did not make a point of it in Harlan when the recording came through. She received Aiken's notification at her address at the homestead, read it once, and set it in the survey satchel beside the other documents. Then she went outside and stood on the low stone step in the February cold and looked at the view of the valley and the cedar ridges and the limestone showing through the hillside. And she stayed there for a while, not celebrating, not particularly dramatic about it, simply present with the thing that had been done and the 11 years it had waited to be done. She wrote to the Pruitt family that week. She had located a forwarding address for Caleb and Martha Pruitt through the Austin City Directory, noting that Caleb Pruitt had died in 1879, which she had half expected, and that the address now listed was in his daughter Delia's name. She wrote a letter of 4 paragraphs. The first explained who she was and how she had come to purchase the property. The second described what she had found in the wall and what the field survey had established. The third described the filing and Aiken's findings in the corrected deed. The fourth said only that the house was standing and the floors were sound and the door still locked properly with a key she had been unable to locate, and that if any member of the family wished to visit the property, they were welcome. 3 weeks later, she received a reply from Delia Pruitt, who was by that time 31 years old and had been 6 years old on the day her father locked the door and they walked off the property with what they could carry. Delia's letter was 4 sentences. The last sentence said that Delia's father had always believed the house would outlast whatever was done to him. He would have been glad to know he was right. Nora Voss folded that letter carefully and put it in the survey satchel between the recording notification and her father's field notebook. By the spring of 1885, she had begun accepting survey work in the surrounding counties, advertising through the county land offices in San Marcos, Fredericksburg, and Kerrville as a licensed field surveyor and boundary consultant. She charged her father's rates and used his notation method without modification because it was precise and because it had already once done exactly what a notation method is supposed to do. She made a point of filing her field books with the county recorder in each county where she worked. She told the recorders it was her standard practice. She did not explain why. Harlan's opinion of her purchase shifted over the spring without anyone formally revising it. Webb, the auctioneer, began tipping his hat when she passed him on the main street. A man named Cord Whitfield, who had said the word reckless loudly enough for her to hear it on the morning she rode out to the property the first time, came to her in April with a question about a fence line on his south pasture, and she walked the boundary with him and gave him her professional finding, and he paid her the fee without discussion, and neither of them mentioned October. She did not remark on any of this. The work had said what it needed to say, and she saw no advantage in adding to it. There was one more thing. In May, the county land officer Aiken wrote to her about an unrelated boundary dispute in a neighboring county, asking if she would serve as consulting surveyor on the case. At the end of the letter, in a postscript that was longer than the postscripts of most county land officers, he noted that her work on the Pruitt filing had been the most complete and well-documented private land claim he had reviewed in 14 years at the office, and that the combination of the Tate letter, the datum pin record, and a Pruitt plat from the tin case had constituted the kind of physical evidence that does not require interpretation because it carries its meaning directly and plainly and without need of argument. He wrote in the last line of the postscript that in a case like this one, the house itself had been the witness. She read that line twice. It was exactly right, and she had not found a way to say it so simply herself. She copied it into the margin of the survey field book she was currently working from, where she kept the observations worth keeping, the ones precise enough to use again. In June, she received a small parcel from Austin, sent by Delia Pruitt's younger brother, a man named Warren, who had been 11 years old when they left the homestead. He had carried the front door key with him for 22 years. He had kept it, he wrote, without knowing whether it would ever serve a purpose out of a stubbornness. He could not fully explain he was enclosing it now, he wrote, because it seemed to him that it belonged to the house. She put the key in the lock and turned it. The lock opened on the first turn. Clean and certain, the bolt drawing back, without hesitation, the way a well-made mechanism behaves when it is in good condition. She locked the door again from the inside. She stood in the main room in the last of the summer evening light. The walls she had learned to read, the floor she had swept, the work table at the height Caleb Pruitt had set it against a survey mark planted by her father, the pins still in the plaster, where Amos Foss had placed them. The southwest corner, sealed and repaired with lime and sand, she had mixed to match the original as closely as she could manage. The tin case was back in its recess behind the fresh mortar, the documents inside it copies now, the originals held by the county recorder, but placed where Caleb Pruitt had placed them, because it seemed to her that the act of returning them completed something that had been open a long time. The swallows were settling into the north eaves. The creek was running below the hill in the long grass of early summer. The cedar held the last light, and the limestone showed pale and firm through the slope, as it always did, as it would go on doing long after anyone still living had gone. She had paid $9 for a house that had been waiting patiently in the dark for someone who knew how to listen to what it had been built to say. Some things take 11 years to arrive at their right ending. Some things, built right from the beginning, need only to wait for the right person to ask the correct question. If this story settled something in you, leave a word in the comments about what you thought Caleb Pruitt understood when he put those documents in the wall. There is another story here of a woman who found something the world had dismissed and brought back what it held, and it is waiting when you are ready. This story is a work of historical fiction. The characters, including Nora Voss, the Pruitt family, and the Bauer Land and Settlement Trust, are invented. The setting, the limestone hill country of central Texas, and the practices depicted, including disputed land assessments and survey data methods used by 19th century land offices, reflect documented conditions of the era. All events are fictional.